Let's bring in one of our go-to legal minds on the program. Ekemini is a legal practitioner joining us from Akwa Ibom State in New York. Ekemini, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
A lot of amendments is going on. Amendments are going on across board. Electoral Act amendment bill, even the Constitution amendment is still in the works. So there seems to be a lot of reform in that sense, or amendment as it is called. But let's focus on the Electoral Act. And one of the biggest highlights that has come out of the Electoral Act amendment is to the effect that now the committee that is putting out this proposal that will be finally laid before the chambers, both chambers of the National Assembly, to see whether it succeeds or not, proposing that the INEC, the Independent National Electoral Commission, the electoral umpire, will not have the burden of proof and no longer the petitioner in this case when election litigations happen, whether at the tribunal or in court, whether it's the appeal court, whatever level of court there is. What do you make of this? Is this a good move? Will it change anything?
Well, I don't see it changing anything. I don't really see it changing anything. Why do I say so? Let me give a bit of a background. I have participated at the election petition tribunals for the respondents and for the petitioner in the last 3 rounds of election in this country. So I understand exactly what INEC comes to do in court, to do at the tribunal. The summary of what INEC comes to the tribunal to do is to tell the courts, my lords, the person that we declared as the winner of this election is truly the person that won. And how do they do that? They come to court with documents, certified true copies of documents, the result sheets, the forms evidencing cancellation of election, and every other forms that they come with. And so when they come, they tender those forms to the tribunal and then tell the tribunal, this is the person that we declared, and truly this is the person that won the election. Now, by law, when certified true copies of documents come from INEC, it is taken to be documents from proper custody, because no other person would be seen to have better documents than INEC. And so it's from proper custody. And when that application of proper custody principle is applied to the court situation there, to the tribunal there, then everything that INEC brings is largely admissible, largely accepted and acted upon by the court. Now, what is going to change now? When you shift the burden of proof from the petitioner to the respondents, is it going to change the fact that INEC will still come to the court with documents to prove their position? It is not going to change. So it's just a case of changing the goalposts. It's just a case of during the halftime of a football match, you see Arsenal switches to the other side, Manchester United switches to the other side. Okay, it doesn't change the goalposts. It's just a matter of fact is this one going this way, this one going the other way. It doesn't change the character of the goalkeeper of each of the sides. It doesn't also change the players. So what Nigeria wants, we need to go beyond changing the burden of proof, the position of the burden of proof. We need to look at the character of INEC. We need to look at the processes of election conducted by INEC. We need to amend beyond the burden of proof. Burden of proof simply means, sometimes it means who talks first in court. So whether it is the petitioner that is talking first, or it is INEC that is talking first, it doesn't change a bad election. It doesn't change the fact that our problem right now is beyond the issue of burden of proof. It is rather systemic. It is rather something that we need to go beyond. Now look at in the last round of election, Obi and Atiku Abubakar, they placed the election petition largely on the promise of INEC that IRAP is going to be used and all of that. And then they said that it is in the guidelines of INEC. But when those matters went to the court, what did the court say? The court said that the guidelines of INEC cannot override the provisions of the Electoral Act. That it is only the Electoral Act that can make provision for IRAP and the rest. So I'm thinking that rather than the National Assembly spending so much time on who carries the burden of proof, they should look at such a situation and then amend the Electoral Act to accommodate the guidelines of INEC so that when INEC makes a promise that is going to be electronically transmitted, for instance, when someone goes to court, he will have a legal backing to anchor his points on and not just have it dismissed. So, like I said, it is beyond the issue of burden of proof. I do not believe that the burden of proof is going to change anything.
But don't litigants have more to worry about, particularly if Nigeria has not dealt with the challenge of the overbearing influence of politicians on INEC? Won't proof then be subject to manipulation if INEC now has the sole responsibility of the burden of proof?
So if we don't sanitize our electoral process and make it such that when election is held at the polling units, the result will stand. If we don't sanitize it, then we're just moving around circles. We're moving around in circles. You see, a bad election is a bad election, and a bad election can easily be defended by the umpire. By law, INEC becomes a necessary party in an election petition. And like I said, what do they come to do? They come to tender documents. Now, who has the documents? It is INEC that has the documents. Who has the stamp? It is INEC. Who has the authorization to certify? It is INEC. So, if it is true that INEC has been part and parcel of the adulteration of the electoral process, they will continue to adulterate the electoral process. Whether we give the burden of proof to them, or we take the burden of proof, the initial burden of proof from them and give it to the petitioner as it is now, or we give them the initial burden of proof, wherever the burden of proof is placed, someone will still come with documents duly certified, admissible before the courts. There are decisions of the Supreme Court that will be cited to support the admissibility of documents coming from INEC, proper custody. So it's not going to change our story. What we need is a holistic sanitization of the electoral process. If we're amending the Electoral Act, which is very unfortunate, in other countries when laws are made, they are made to last for a long period of time. In our country, the Electoral Act is amended after every election. Every 4 years, it is the most amended piece of legislation in Nigeria. We must have a system in place where if we make a law today, it can last for 20 years. But we don't have that, so we have to keep amending. Now, as we're amending the Electoral Act, let the National Assembly look at issues that are realistic, okay? Very realistic issues, and not the issue of burden of proof. Burden of proof simply means sometimes who talks first. So it doesn't matter who talks first. What matters is a pure electoral system like we have in other countries. Look at Ghana. In the last 3 rounds of general elections in Ghana, the margin of victory is very slim. It is 55, 46, 56, 43, and so on. But as you have a very wide margin of victory and so on. So we need to work with the partners in the electoral process and ensure that whatever amendment we are making is a kind of amendment that will be realistic, is a kind of amendment that will allow INEC to apply technology to the electoral process. And when someone goes to court to challenge the flaw that has occurred, via the application of technology, the person will have a law to anchor it on, and not the current situation where the court will say, well, guidelines cannot take the place of the Electoral Act. We need to do more. We need to go beyond the issue of placement of burden of proof.
All right, Mr. Kamini, in doing more, and I'm learning a few things, and one of the things I'm just learning is to the effect that, which I would like you to speak to, is that, sometimes INEC is quite reluctant to produce election results. We've seen this situation before. So this one is particularly the fact that they will not only be required to produce the result, INEC will be required to defend the results. Isn't that a difference that this will make?
No, there's no difference. Practically speaking, demonstrating it in the courts, there is no difference. What's difficult in INEC coming to defend a bad election when they have all the results at their disposal? They fill in the forms, okay? They stamp it, they bring it to the courts. It's not difficult for them to defend. Why? Because the law already is in their favor. The law says that documents that come from INEC, results that come from INEC, duly certified and paid for, are from proper custody. So you that is challenging, it will take so much from you to be able to challenge. As a matter of fact, you need to also bring counter results to be able to counter their own results. So the odds, are still so much in favor of INEC. And therefore, theoretically telling INEC you go to court, you defend. It's not different. What they have been doing so far is to defend what they have declared. So, some things are very beautiful when they're in theoretical form. But when you bring them to the practical courtroom for demonstration, you see that there's no difference. There's absolutely not going to be any difference if INEC is meant to bear the burden of proof this time around as against the petitioner. Because if the system is bad, INEC will still come and then defend a bad election and defend whatever they have declared. So I am rather of the opinion, the strongest opinion, that see, we need to look at the demons in our electoral process. And we deal with the demons. We deal with them holistically. Like I have said, the court said, IREF cannot stand because it is not in the Electoral Act, it is in the guidelines. In elementary jurisprudence, we were taught that if guidelines are made pursuant to the provisions of an act, the guidelines take the force of the act. But the court has said recently that, see, IREF cannot stand because it is not in the Electoral Act. Now, I expect the National Assembly to amend the Electoral Act and then include a provision that will make IREF and other electronic gadgets introduced by the new chairman of INEC to stand. Anything outside that, then we're still telling the same story in different forms, still running in circles, and I don't see the electoral system of this country improving only or principally on the issue of burden of proof.
Backdrop of the intention of the National Assembly now, can we see the same zeal applied to this proposal for the change of date in elections to 2026, such that litigations matters can be settled before swearing-in date? This proposal for the burden of proof to be given to INEC. Can we see the same zeal in elements just as critical, some would say even more critical, to items on the electoral reform that have to do with INEC being placed on first-line charge, that have to do with the appointment of the electoral umpire and the powers of INEC to review its election result? Are you confident that we'll see the same zeal from the lawmakers in moving and accelerating those elements on the electoral reform? And would it move the needle?
Well, it might move the needle if the amendments are done holistically and honestly, and they are made in such a way that application is not going to be difficult. Because it is one thing to make provisions in the law. It's another thing to make it possible for it to be implemented. If not, you make a provision and one legal argument will throw it off balance and then returns us to where we have come from. So it might move the needle. As a matter of fact, members of the National Assembly, they have an obligation to the Nigerian nation to ensure that whatever amendment is to be done is done in the interest of the nation and not for their own, interest. Because you remember that there was an amendment that was done in the last electoral act by the National Assembly to the extent that I think non-executive members of political parties were not to participate at congresses or something or primaries. And it ended up affecting so many of the legislators. They never saw that one coming. So they must be able to amend, not for selfish reasons, but amend for the Nigerian nation, because it's getting embarrassing that every round of election in this country had to end up in court. As a matter of fact, in most instances, it is the courts that decide for the people. So it's always sad when I see electoral panel is constituted. We go for election, and the next thing that you see being constituted is a panel of judges to try, the cases that will come from court, which already means that we know for sure that these elections will be, seriously disputed, and that's why we have kept aside judges to attend to these things. You hardly see this in other countries. They face election. They don't face litigation inside election. So we have a situation in this country where so much is given to the courts when it comes to the electoral process. We must be able to allow the courts to do other things. In American jurisprudence, very little is said of election. The same with other countries, even in Africa. So we must have a nation where our votes will count at the polling units. You see, INEC should not be taking Nigerians for granted. Remember the tenure of the last INEC chairman. He promised that a particular thing was going to be done. It was going to be transmitted real time. And when it was not transmitted, the argument we heard was there were glitches. The other one said, I never promised that. No, we must go beyond that. And the Electoral Act must be amended to provide consequences for the chairman of INEC who promises to do a thing and fails to do it only to come and tell us about glitches. We're not interested in glitches. We're interested in free and fair election at all times that elections are conducted. And Professor Amupiton, he has the first task on his shoulders, the Anambra election that is coming up next month. We want to see a new INEC where election results will count. We want to see an INEC that is like Ghana, where Dr. Baumea was able to call the current president of Ghana like 8 hours before the close of polls because he saw that the electoral process was transparent. Why do we not have transparent electoral process in Nigeria when we have all the resources, human and financial? I think that it should now be an embarrassment for Nigeria that every round of election is tested in courts. You have like 1,000 cases in courts arising from one election. I think it should be enough time for Nigeria to now say, enough is enough. Let us get it right. And to the National Assembly, if you are amending, we need to amend once and allow it to stay for 20 years. The American Constitution, for instance, was last amended in 1992. How many years now? That was the 27th Amendment of the American Constitution. They don't amend laws every time. So let the National Assembly amend the Electoral Act once and for all this time around and make it holistic. Let it be able to serve us for 20 years. And let us have the amendment to serve the nation and not the interest of the individual politician in the National Assembly.
Well, interesting points. I mean, I was beginning to wind down, and when it comes to our elections and litigations, they are like literally 5 and 6, and it's a systemic problem. It's not an isolated problem. We have a crisis of confidence across our institutions. So no matter what happens, you see, everything is literally being tested. We hope we can get to that day where we see neighboring countries with lesser population being able to declare results and nobody heads to court. But there's a generic question I want to ask you, since you've been in court and been part of electoral jurisprudence. Presidential election, for instance, and what I'm about to ask is why politicians, I think, behave the way they do. Because the average politician will tell you, especially when it comes to presidential election, if you don't win at the poll, on the field, forget about winning in court. Because of the level of proof that you need to have to be able to obtain a presidential election. Is that even possible in the first place?
Well, the burden of proof right now in the country, going by the principles in our law books, is such that for you to prove irregularities in a presidential election, you must prove it polling unit by polling unit. So if you are alleging irregularities in the entire 36 states of the Federation and all the polling units and all the wards, then you have that burden to prove all of that substantially before you can win a presidential election petition. And that's peculiar. In fact, that's impossible. Now, we still have laws that say you must bring people polling units by polling units in an age of technology where we should have the electoral process fully in compliance with the computers and all that technology. How did Kenya decide the presidential election, the just concluded election, I think 2 years ago, where President William Ruto, the current president of Kenya, became announced as the winner? Raila Odinga took him to court, the late Raila Odinga, and it was decided in 14 days. Lawyers were heard, judgments given in 14 days, everything 14 days. It was made possible because the Kenyan electoral system has complied so much with technology. So it was just a matter of printing out what was done at the polling units and sitting down to compare notes and then make a declaration. But ours says you must bring in witnesses, polling units by polling units, and that makes it impossible for anyone to upturn a presidential election in Nigeria. So we must come to a point where we stop, making ourselves a laughing stock for the international community, where we still require people to come from their villages to prove what happened polling units by polling unit. Let us deploy technology to the electoral process. Any process in this life that has no business with technology is still in its stone age. I'm talking to you far away from where you are, and we are hearing ourselves. That's technology. For the electoral system of Nigeria not to apply technology the way it should and the way others are applying, this is the biggest bane of the electoral process in Nigeria. We must introduce technology. We must do so holistically and honestly. When people tamper with the electoral process technologically, there should be punishments for them. And this is what I expect the National Assembly to include in its amendment. Whoever becomes a victim, whoever becomes a culprit, whether it's a highly placed politician or so, or the person sent by the highly placed politician, or whether it's somebody from INEC working in cahoots with politicians, let there be punishment. Let someone knows that as he is going in to adulterate the electoral process, there are consequences that he is going to face. And until we have that, it will be difficult to upturn any election petition, any presidential election petition in Nigeria, let alone, and others will still be, the same thing. So we need to be real to ourselves. To thyself be true. We need to tell ourselves that as a nation. We need an electoral process that is pure. And so anything that contaminates the streams of that process should be taken off. Amendments should be done to cure all of that, so that we can stand firm as a nation that can proudly say the president was elected by all of us, the member of parliament was elected by me, and so on. Until we have that, then this country will not have that recognition and respect that we deserve from other countries of the world.
Keminudim, as always, thank you so much for your perspective. I think at the end of the day, we should just pray for courage for leaders of the institutions of state like INEC to be able to do the right thing, because we'll say all we can, but they are under a lot of pressure, sometimes even threats. We've seen some of them even killed. But we hope that we're going to get out of these murky waters someday to have credible elections where you know that if you lost the election, it's because you lost. If you won, you know that you won, and not anything else. Ekeminudim is a legal practitioner. Thank you so much. We'll allow you head to court now. Thank you. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
From legal issues, electoral reforms, we'll be shifting gears to issues around the Niger Delta. Yes, they say the goose that lays the golden egg. We'll talk about oil spill and that environment. Join us in just a moment. We'll be right back.